Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, earlier this year, a man named William, who is from Gig Harbor, Washington, my home state, wrote to me to express his frustration with what he saw happening here in Congress. William served in the Navy, and he now works for a tech company that supports Navy communications in the Pacific Northwest. And like so many Americans in recent years, he has witnessed hiring freezes and cutbacks and furloughs and layoffs. He said a couple years ago he was hoping for a promotion, but now he considers himself just lucky to have a job, and he's not even sure how long he can count on that. Well, Mr. President, William's not alone. The partisanship and the gridlock here in Washington, D.C. has been devastating for families just like his in my home state of Washington and across the country. The government shutdown and the debt limit brinksmanship last month were just the latest examples. But Congress has been lurching from crisis to crisis to crisis for years, and it has got to end. So, Mr. President, today I'm going to share a few stories from families who've been paying the price for the dysfunction here in Congress. I've worked very hard to make sure voices like theirs are heard loud and clear in the budget process, and I'm going to keep fighting to make sure their interests are represented every day as we work now towards a balanced and bipartisan budget agreement. Mr. President, 7 months ago, the House and the Senate each passed our budgets. The Senate budget that we passed here was built on three principles. First of all, our highest priority was investing in jobs and economic growth and prosperity that was built from the middle out, not from the top down. Secondly, the deficit has been now cut in half, and we build on the $2.5 trillion in deficit reduction that we have passed now since 2011 to continue to tackle this challenge fairly and responsibly. And third, our budget keeps the promises that we have made to our seniors and our families and our communities. The budget that passed the House reflects different values and priorities, but it was our job to get in a room, make some compromises with them, and find a way to bring those two budgets together. Although I had hoped we could start this bipartisan budget negotiations far sooner and avoided last month's crisis, the budget conference that now has begun, started last week, offers us now the opportunity to break this cycle of gridlock and dysfunction and start moving our country back in the right direction. We have a chance now to turn our attention back to where it belongs, strengthening our economy and creating jobs, to continue making responsible spending cuts while closing wasteful tax loopholes that are used by the wealthiest Americans and biggest corporations, and to finally show the American people that Congress can work together. We can compromise and alleviate the uncertainty and the pain that families across the country are facing. Mr. President, the effects of these years of gridlock are clear in places like the Denise Louie Education Center in Seattle. I visited that Head Start program earlier this year, where pre-K students from low-income families can learn their ABCs and take part in story time and benefit from health and nutrition programs. Even before the major cuts to Head Start that took effect last March, that center had a waiting list. Now, the director of the school has had to drop kids from that program because of these tight budget constraints. And they are far from alone. Another Head Start program in Everett, Washington, a program that served needy kids since the 1970s, had to completely shut its doors this summer because Congress couldn't work together. That one facility alone was helping 40 kids prepare for kindergarten. Nationwide, these cuts have forced tens of thousands of children out of Head Start as well. And that's not all. The senseless cuts from sequestration have impacted education programs all across the country. Researchers and scientists who are working on cures for cancer and other diseases have lost their jobs. Programs like Meals on Wheels that deliver food to seniors have been cut, and there's so much more. The ripples of this so-called sequestration have been felt in our homes, in our businesses, and across our fragile economy. The across-the-board cuts have also had, of course, serious impact on defense programs and workers. Earlier this year, I heard from one of my constituents whose family was impacted by this very directly. His name's Bob. He's from Bremerton, Washington. He's an engineer at the Puget Sound Naval Shipyard. He told me every day highly skilled employees come into his office, often in tears, and tell him they don't know how they are going to manage to make ends meet if they're furloughed or laid off. They're worried now. They've felt the pain for months. They know it could get worse. Because, Mr. President, if these automatic cuts are not replaced in a bipartisan deal, another $20 billion is scheduled to be cut from defense spending in January, just a few short months from now. That would make more furloughs and layoffs much more likely, and it would mean continued and deeper cuts to combat training. Well, Mr. President, it doesn't have to be this way, because something both Democrats and Republicans agree on is that at the very least, this budget conference should be able to accomplish the absolute minimum is finding a path to replace those terrible sequestration cuts and set a budget level for at least the short term. Republican Congressman Hal Rogers, he's the House Appropriations Committee chairman, he said sequestration and its unrealistic and ill-conceived discretionary cuts must be brought to an end. Even House Speaker John Boehner said the cuts would hollow out our military. And just recently, the House Armed Services Committee Republicans sent me and Chairman Ryan a letter urging us to replace sequestration, saying it was, quote, never intended to be policy. Well, Mr. President, that's exactly right. Sequestration was intended to be so bad it would drive both sides to the table to be willing to make some compromises to replace it with smarter savings. And I'm very glad that more and more of our colleagues from both sides of this aisle are stepping up to try and find a solution. So the question now is not whether we should replace this across-the-board sequester cuts, but how we do it. The House and the Senate budgets both deal with sequestration, just in different ways. The House budget fully replaces the defense cuts and lifts the BCA cap. They pay for that by cutting even more deeply into key domestic investments. Our Senate budget, on the other hand, replaces all of the automatic cuts and pays for it with an equal mix of responsible spending cuts and revenue that we raised by closing wasteful tax loopholes. So, Mr. President, finding a bipartisan solution won't be easy. We all know that. It will require compromise from both sides. And as I mentioned at our first Budget Committee conference last week, I'm going into this process ready to offer some tough spending cuts that, unlike the sequester caps that disappear in 2022, would be permanently locked into law. I know there are many Republicans who would be very interested in swapping some of the inefficient and damaging cuts from sequestration with structural changes to programs that would save many multiples of the cuts they replace over the coming decades. In short, I'm willing to compromise. I'm ready to listen to Republican ideas. And as long as their proposals are fair for seniors and families, I'm prepared to make some tough concessions to get this deal done. But I can't negotiate by myself. Compromise has to run both ways. That means, in addition to the responsible spending cuts, Republicans need to work with us to close wasteful tax loopholes and special interest subsidies, because it would be unfair and unacceptable to put the entire burden of deficit reduction on the backs of our seniors and our families. And it shouldn't be difficult for Republicans to agree to put just a few of the most egregious, wasteful loopholes and special interest carve-outs on the table to get a balanced and bipartisan deal. If the choice is between closing a wasteful loophole and lurching to another crisis, I hope every one of my colleagues would put their constituents before special interests. Mr. President, over the last few years, people across the country have lost a great deal of confidence in Congress's ability to work together for the good of our nation. People like Nani King, who, as the New York Times recently reported, serves as a registered nurse at Madigan Army Medical Center in my home state of Washington. During the shutdown last month, she worked without pay. and without a paycheck, she had to dip into her retirement account to make her monthly mortgage payment. Now, even though the shutdown is over, her family can't take any chances. She told the Times, quote, "We just have too much to lose." Mr. President, we here in Congress owe it to her family and to families all over this country to work to find a path forward. So let's put an end to this gridlock. Let's put an end to these crises. Let's show the American people we're listening to them. In fact, let's show them that their stories are more important than sticking to party lines or staying in ideological corners. We've got to rebuild some trust, and we can do that. We need to find a path to compromise. We need to work together to strengthen our economy and create jobs. I'm ready to do that in this budget conference. I'm hopeful that over the coming weeks, every one of my colleagues on that committee will make it clear that they are as well. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor. I suggest the absence of a quorum.